Welcome to our Israel update. Today, I'm pleased to have with us Dr. Seth Frantzman, who's Chief Middle East Correspondent and analyst with the Jerusalem Post, also a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and an author of a number of books. And all the books and places where you can follow Seth will be listed in the show notes below. He's written books on and if I get the titles wrong, Seth, correct me, After ISIS, Drone Wars, and the October 7th War, which was just recently published. Excellent, all excellent books. Highly recommend them. Seth, welcome to our Israel update.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So, Seth, I want to kind of go back a little bit into your book about After ISIS and some of the things you wrote about. And I'll confess to you, when I first read that book, I felt like I was reading a modern horror novel, and it became even worse when I realized that you were just reporting on the facts on the ground. But during that time, and I think you posted last week, you posted a picture of you in Mosul with what I think were American forces as they were clearing out ISIS there in Mosul. Is my recollection correct on that?
I posted several photos. One of them was a picture of me next to a tank. It was an Iraqi army tank.
Okay.
And then I also posted a photo with several other Iraqi soldiers next to a missile launcher, basically. But both of the pictures were from the battles for Mosul. It was from the first beginning of that battle in 2016 in like October.
Okay. And you had also written a lot about the Yazidis, and any comments or thoughts when you saw that Yazidi woman recently released from captivity?
Sure. I mean, the story of the Yazidis, has some commonalities with not only with the Jewish people, but also with the persecution that not only Jews have faced, but also the Islamist ISIS type of Hamas attacks are kind of similar. So I would say that even though obviously the story of the Jewish people is quite different, but the Yazidis are a minority group in Iraq. They were attacked by ISIS in 2014, and they were subjected to genocide. It's one of many attacks or genocides against this people over the last hundreds of years. Now, in the case of this woman, she was trafficked initially from Iraq, as I understand it, to Syria by ISIS. She was married off at a young age after she was, enslaved, forcibly married, had one or two kids, I think. And then at some point, she was like in a detention camp after ISIS was defeated. She ended up apparently transiting maybe through Turkey at some point and ended up in Gaza. It's a very complicated story, but the overall message is she was trafficked and she was kidnapped, and it's very similar to the hostage taking and kidnapping that Hamas did. So the fact that she ended up in Gaza, I think, is just one of these parallels where we see that the direct parallel that the persecution people were subjected to in Iraq, which is, Yazidis, Kurds, Christians, all sorts of people, is the same type of ideology that underpins the Hamas treatment of women, of minorities, of Jews. It's very similar, even though people argue that theologically there's obviously some differences between the extremism of ISIS or Hamas, but there's certainly, in terms of their vile nature, there's a lot of commonalities.
So it was certainly a great day when she was released after apparently about 10 years in captivity. Let me ask you this. You've written a lot, and we have limited time today, so I know we're not going to get through all of the subjects that we have. But you did spend some time in Mosul, and you saw sort of the worst of ISIS, the effects of ISIS, and how ISIS had embedded itself there in that city, and what the American and Iraqi forces faced as they tried to eradicate or end that counterinsurgency or whatever it was they called it. Can you draw any parallels from that experience to what you've seen happening in Gaza with Hamas?
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels. I think that ISIS was a group that obviously started kind of in Iraq, then ended up in Syria, and then in 2014 burst onto the scene by taking over Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq. It's a big city. It sits on two sides of a river. I guess it's the Tigris River. And it's a big urban area, especially the part on the western side of that river, which they call the right bank, because if you're going downriver, it's on the right. Anyway, so ISIS controlled that city. It was a heartland in terms of ISIS and a lot of the ISIS crimes. In terms of the persecution of Christians, they expelled Christians, and I think in June of 2014 when they took over, and then they attacked the Yazidis in August and attacked the Kurds. So, and Mosul was the center of that. It's also where they destroyed monuments and museums and things. When the Iraqi army decided to retake Mosul, it was a very complicated, long battle, and it's a battlefield that stretches over dozens of kilometers. And I think it's not actually that different in size and shape to Gaza, and it's not that different in terms of population. There were about 2 million people in Mosul in 2014. When the war ended, there were less because a lot of them had fled the fighting, but that's the same in Gaza. Most people had fled the fighting. I mean, they fled to other areas in Gaza. So I think the challenges were very similar. I think the difference is actually in the outcomes. The Iraqi army began to go into eastern Mosul in October 2016. And it was slow going. They chipped away at all the areas around the city, like these villages that are Nineveh Plains. Then they started to go into the neighborhoods that were kind of newer neighborhoods that were built in the Saddam era. And they were immediately ambushed and attacked because ISIS, kind of like Hamas, uses tunnels and all sorts of things and booby traps. So the Iraqis suffered some casualties. They had to slow down. It took them months to take over eastern Mosul. Then they crossed the river. And I was in both of these campaigns a bit pieces of them. They crossed the river and they kind of went south around Mosul. They encircled it. Then they went into the old city in like February, March of 2017. It took them until like June to defeat ISIS. So that's almost 9 months, I think. So when Israel started to go into Gaza, it faced kind of the same dilemmas of fighting in the urban area. What do you do with the people? I think the result is different. Israel was able to defeat Hamas in lots of areas of Gaza, but it didn't fully defeat Hamas and get rid of Hamas as an organization. That's why Hamas still controls parts of Gaza, and ISIS doesn't control parts of Mosul. So I would say that, you know, there are lessons to be learned. In my view, the Iraqi campaign was quite successful, but the Iraqi campaign has positive aspects on the side of it that the Israelis weren't able to exploit, which is the fact that the local people didn't all really like ISIS, and they were able. The Iraqis Iraqis themselves are Arabs, so they were fighting against other Arabs, and they were able to then remove one group and use other locals there to run the show. And Israel doesn't have an Arab partner, and I think that makes things more difficult in Gaza.
So, with respect to how things have gone in Gaza, well, let me ask you one other question. Was I assume that ISIS had not been as deeply embedded, and correct me if I'm wrong, was not as deeply embedded in Mosul in the sense that they didn't have this hundreds of miles of a tunnel system that they had constructed in the short time that they had controlled Mosul, compared to I think everybody was surprised at the extensive tunnel network in Gaza. At least that's what it appears. How does that issue with the tunnel system in Gaza and how deeply, you know, Hamas has had 18 years to embed itself in Gaza, how does that sort of compare to what was faced up in Mosul with ISIS?
So that's true. In Mosul, the ISIS had taken over the city in June 2014, so it had 2 years to fortify it. It's true they didn't have tunnels everywhere. They had lots of IEDs, lots of weapons. They even used drones, which was interesting. But I think that, yeah, I mean, it's true. Hamas benefited from controlling Gaza as a totalitarian mini-state since 2007, and Hamas has roots in Gaza going back decades to 1988 or 80s or something. But Hamas, yeah, it had a long time to prepare the ground against Israel, and Hamas also had collaborators among the international community, the NGOs, UN. It seems like that basically either allowed Hamas to work with them or hired Hamas members or outsourced to them. So I think that was more nefarious than ISIS. ISIS didn't have UN facilities and stuff to work with. So that was a big difference. And I think the thing about ISIS, it should be remembered, ISIS did not just come out of nowhere. It was very much it fed on Iraqi Sunni Islamist tendencies or grievances. So we should remember that Mosul is a partly Sunni Arab city. It is a city that had the highest participation rate in Saddam's officer corps. So there was no shortage of men with military experience, former Saddam-era soldiers who were demobilized in 2003 and basically sat around from 2003 to 2013, waiting to join another insurgency. Some of them did join the insurgency, like in 2005, 6, 7. Then they went back home. Then they joined ISIS. So there are some parallels with the long-term aspect of Hamas rule, but it's not quite the same because you're right. They didn't have the ability to fortify the city as much.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make. So let me ask you about that so when the U.S. goes in and defeats Saddam, and these guys, as you said, are demobilized, and they have to do something with the skills that they have, and they sort of latch onto insurgencies, and eventually ISIS. Is that also a concern with how things are going to go in the future in Gaza?
I think in Gaza, it seems the chances of Hamas returning are pretty good unless you eradicate it, because Hamas still controls, if you think of Gaza as like a big, shaped like a brick kind of, it still controls a piece in the middle and also a whole bunch of other little areas. So it's going to be hard, I think, to really defang and uproot Hamas. And it's not entirely clear that the Israeli government wants to replace it. So I think that's the big trouble Israel's going to face. Now, is it like ISIS? The thing about it is, yeah, you had a generation of guys there who would have, I guess, maybe left the army under Saddam or were younger, and they gravitated towards a Sunni Islamist insurgency. And that has, roots in the same ideology as Hamas, Al-Qaeda, other groups. But, that insurgency ISIS, I think, is totally defeated now. So I think it's worth noting that I do think that probably it's possible to defeat Hamas. It's just a question of having the wherewithal to do it.
So let's go back to October 6th. You wrote a book, The October 7th War, about what's happened since. But what was the failure, or what do you think? And I know this is under investigation and everything's still a little bit speculative. What was the failure that led to what appears to be a complete stand down or inability to understand or refuse to believe what was coming in Gaza? What happened?
Well, it's important. I mean, I think we need to, it's going to take a long time to know everything, but the book that I wrote tries to give a blow-by-blow account, as it was experienced on the ground by people, and also to then go back a little bit and understand a bit of how this happened. I would say that the surprise attack on Israel is similar to many other surprise attacks in history, whether it's the Pearl Harbor attack or the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968, or Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi German invasion of Russia, or, whatever you want to look at in history, going back to the Roman Empire. So surprise attacks happen a lot in history, and they happen the same way. And when things go wrong, they go wrong very quickly. it's like what happened to, George Custer when he ran into the Indians at Sitting Bull's camp, and all the Custer's men the 7th Cavalry got massacred. When things go wrong badly. And I think that for Israel, a lot of the same, aspects of any of these historical examples would have parallels, in the sense that Israel was quite arrogant in assuming that Hamas was weak and defeated and deterred. Israel had a lot of technology, just like the Americans did in Vietnam in '68. And technology is not a magic wand. Technology gives you all sorts of tools to defeat an enemy. But technology cannot always stand up against, waves and waves of zealot crazy people that are willing to massacre and kill you. And the thing is, it's actually interesting, the number of American MPs and soldiers on duty in Tet 68, I think in Saigon, was a few hundred against thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attackers. And it seems that the same case happened on the border of Gaza. There were just 400 or so, or 500 armed IDF soldiers facing several thousand Hamas members. And they were overrun. And once they were overrun, then Hamas was able to come out and massacre. Now, Israel historically has always known that its enemies are willing to massacre, and its enemies sometimes have more people. So Israel historically relies on great and good intelligence to preempt that. But when we look back at the October 7th attack, the intelligence did not pick up on this operation. It seems to me the intelligence, in a sense, it's not that it didn't pick up on it. They knew that Hamas was training for this type of attack. They didn't believe it could be done. And they were much more worried about Hezbollah in the north carrying out a very similar type of attack. And they assumed Hezbollah was the much more dangerous organization, which it was dangerous. But I think it's important then to go back and say, well, actually, Hamas was in some ways the more bloodthirsty, genocidal one, because Hamas has an ideology to replace Israel with a Palestinian state. The Hezbollah, also talks about destroying Israel, but I don't think Hezbollah ever thinks that it's going to march on Jerusalem. It likes the idea of, taking over some areas in the north or something. But I think the Hamas genocidal historical example is that we've known Hamas since the 1990s is willing to blow up buses and stuff. I mean, it's the worst type of organization. So unfortunately, a lot of complacency allowed it to get the jump on Israel, and there weren't enough weapons. There weren't enough armed soldiers. There were far too many people that were left defenseless, including IDF women soldiers, of which there were dozens on the border that day, who didn't even have weapons to defend themselves, and some were killed and some were captured. So it's an unmitigated, massive military disaster. I tried to tell the story of that in the book, and I tried to tell the story of recovery and resilience, and how people, average people fought, and how heroic people were that went down. People who woke up that morning in northern Israel and drove 2 hours to fight on the border. So you have examples of colonels and generals, and high-level ranking officers who literally showed up with a personal Jeep and a sidearm or a rifle and went right into battle. So I think that's an important story as well, as part of what worked that day.
Was there, and I know you've written a lot about this, was there I guess a political failure that everybody thought they could manage the Hamas issue somehow? Is that what was going on? That they thought they could, they'd let money go in and they could manage the problem?
Yeah, Israel was addicted to this idea that what they called mowing the grass, or shrinking the conflict, or all sorts of other ridiculous terms that was given to this idea that over here you have a genocidal terrorist organization. It's like having a neighbor who's a murderer. And not only is the neighbor's a murderer, but they have a bunch of vicious dogs that are, and you say to yourself, yeah, but there's a door between us. It's like, yeah, okay, but this is not an acceptable situation. And, Hamas is a genocide organization. It showed this. And Israel got used to the fact that with high technology and all sorts of things like F-35s, that it could win every little round with Hamas. And there were all sorts of rounds. There was if you recall back, Israel left Gaza in 2005. Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. Then Hamas had already kidnapped Gilad Shalit. Israel fought a short campaign in 2006 against Hamas. Then Israel fought Hezbollah in 2006. Then Israel fought Hamas again in 2008 and 2009. Then there was another war in 2012 and 2014 and 2018 and 2021. I mean, it was basically all the time. It got to the point where you had a conflict every 6 months. And they would be a conflict for like a few days. And every time Israel would say afterward, well, we won. And the IDF would give a list of all the things that were destroyed. The problem with, precision warfare and counting the number of things you destroy is, you can have a huge list of things that you destroy, but you have to ask yourself, can the enemy rebuild it? Well, if you destroy an observation post that is basically a shed, yes, the enemy can rebuild it. Now, did you kill one enemy or two? In general, if you look at the wars Israel fought against Hamas, not very many people were being killed. I mean, in terms of Hamas members. Well, so it seems to me that I think Israel just drew the wrong conclusions from the data. And Hamas drew other conclusions. Hamas thought, okay, the Israelis will do all sorts of precision strikes, but they won't kill all of us. And all we have to do is get around the border fence. And I think, by the way, Hamas thinks the same thing today. They've lost, Israel estimates, up to 17,000 members of Hamas have been killed. Maybe yes, maybe no, but that doesn't matter that much. Hamas is recruiting every day. Every day, Hamas is returning to areas that Israel cleared. So, unfortunately, I think the same story is being told again a bit of, well, Hamas capabilities have been defeated. Yeah, the capabilities like rockets have been defeated, but the enemy will rebuild them. So the question is, do you leave the enemy there to let them do that? And then find out in 10 years you have to fight them again? I think that's the big question mark that Israel has to ask itself.
So currently we've got this, well, for example, right now there's some kind of proposal. There's always a proposal on the table. And I think I read this morning somewhere that Hamas has rejected the most recent ceasefire proposal. And I guess my question is, Sinwar's dead. They killed a guy who the UN and UNRWA guy who the UN Guterres was lamenting his demise the other day. It's terrible they killed one of our colleagues. And there's videos of him taking hostages on October 7th. But so my question is, who's leading Hamas now? Does anybody even know?
I think the general consensus is it's probably Sinwar's brother. I think his name is Mohammed Sinwar, who was already like a high-level commander in Hamas. I think the assumption is he's in charge now. But and he's not Sinwar, but I think the Hamas has shown over the years, let's remember, that it can replace its leaders again and again. Back in the day, I remember Israel killed Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was one of the founders of Hamas, and he was killed in the early 2000s. They replaced him with another guy named Rantisi, and then Israel killed Rantisi, and then they just replaced him. I mean, if you Google Hamas members, assassinated or something by Israel, it's not a small number, and they keep replacing them. I think the organization kind of expects this. They're not stupid people. They know that they're fighting a very serious country in terms of Israel, but they have a long-term view, which is eventually they think that there's enough of them that they'll surmount this somehow. So I think history has shown that, it's important not to underestimate. On the other side of the coin, there's no doubt they've lost lots of commanders and they've lost all sorts of senior people. Some of people who Israel tried to kill back in the day, like Mohammed Def, they finally got him, and Marwan Issa, I guess. And, Sinwar himself was in Israeli prisons for a long time. So it's good that it's come full circle for him. But I do think they will try to regrow themselves. It might take them a bit more time this time, but unless they are, fully cut off from the roots.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so let's move to Lebanon. And because it's a similar problem, deeply embedded group, 40 years of building tunnels and facilities in southern Lebanon. And, right now it looks like Israel's doing pretty well in Lebanon. But then I see this morning, even people within the Israeli press talking about a ceasefire proposal in Lebanon, and people are saying, oh, it looks pretty good and we can stop and pull back. And what just kind of give us some sense of what's going on up there and what we should be looking for in the days and weeks ahead, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, Israel has been under attack by Hezbollah since October 8th, which is a day after the Hamas attack. Hezbollah began its attack on Israel, and Hezbollah basically began by attacking areas near the border, and Israel evacuated like 100,000 people from the border because of this, fears that there would be another October 7th. And so Hezbollah read that as a huge win, and they just kept attacking, but kind of close to the border. They called it the equation. They said, okay, we're allowed to attack up to 5 miles, and then Israel will attack us. But in Hezbollah's view, they were kind of winning this war because they were not deterred. On September 23, Israel decided to launch a campaign called Operation Northern Arrows to defeat Hezbollah. And it prepared the way for that with the airstrikes on Hezbollah commanders, and then the exploding pagers, which Israel never took responsibility for, but people assume it was Israel. So I think the goal of Israel was to eradicate most of the mid-level and high-level commanders very quickly, so Hezbollah couldn't respond effectively. And I think Israel did that quite well. They also killed Hassan Nasrallah, who was the head of Hezbollah. And then Israel launched a ground campaign in October with 4 divisions. Well, if you read military history, you'd think, well, 4 divisions, that's like lots of people. That must be 120,000 men or something. It's not really. It's 10 or 20,000. And the 4 divisions have gone into Lebanon. You can imagine like 4 fingers, just little bits. They've gone in like a mile or 2, and they're trying to clear all the Hezbollah munitions that are on the border. And Hezbollah has spent, decades building forts on the border. You can imagine forts that are 24 feet underground, rooms, bathrooms, like a little miniature, not a city, but little miniature towns underground, full of weapons and everything. And they've done the same thing in the towns in southern Lebanon. So it's very hard to clear all this stuff up. It takes time. Now, after a month of fighting, or a little bit more, and about 30 Israeli soldiers killed, and now 5 more people killed today in a farm in northern Israel by Hezbollah rockets. People are being killed almost every day in Israel by these attacks. The question is whether there will be a ceasefire and whether Lebanon will adhere to the UN resolution that's supposed to keep Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. In my view, there's no evidence that the Lebanese government will ever do that, because they're basically weak and they're basically controlled by Hezbollah, and the international community doesn't have the backbone to tell Hezbollah to stop. So it seems to me, well, there could be a ceasefire, and it seems that the Hezbollah will slowly regrow its tentacles and rebuild its munitions and stuff. There are different assessments of whether or not Israel's destroyed, up to 80% of the Hezbollah rockets and stuff. I tend to think that's not accurate. I think it's 50% or something. But even if it's 80%, it's 80% of 150,000 rockets. That leaves like 40,000 rockets, which is way too many. I mean, Hezbollah only had 13,000 rockets in 2006, and it was an incredibly dangerous organization. So this group is incredibly dangerous and still strong enough. We should not kid ourselves that it's been totally defeated or weakened.
Is it sending the message, like, the fact that this is being considered, as you mentioned, 5 people killed around Metula today, the north essentially emptied out of people, the towns and villages up there, Kiryat Shimona, Metula, empty. And now it seems like they've expanded their rocket attacks for, like, they're, hitting Haifa all the time, and the suburbs around Haifa, even down to Netanya. Is a message being sent to them that, like, well, you killed 30 soldiers, you killed 5 civilians, but we can manage that. Is that the message that they're getting?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what do they think? I mean, yeah, they seem to think they've done pretty well. Now, they've obviously lost a bunch of people. They lost 500 men between October 8th, 2023 and September 15th, 2024. So they'd already taken a bunch of losses. They've lost another estimates 1,000 to 2,000 men. And so that's a loss for them. And Israel has lost certainly a lot less than that. But I get the sense from Hezbollah and the Iranian axis in general. Remember, it's not just Hezbollah, it's Iran. They don't mind losing people. They don't mind that. They call it the equation, as I said before. For them, it's a win. Israel evacuated people from the north. Israel's never done that since 1948. And Israel's whole raison d'etre in the region is generally not to retreat. I don't mean that they didn't do the disengagement and the Sinai thing. I mean, it never leaves the parts of Israel of 1948-49 borders. Israel's never decided it will just leave part of that. And I think that's the key thing. Hezbollah thinks that they basically handed Israel defeat like worse than 48. And that's not good to have your enemies think they won. So, that's a good question, is how they think. My assumption is that they think they've done okay. They've lost lots of people as well. So it's not all rosy for them. But they like being martyrs. That's their thing. They are happy to be a martyr in this cause. For them, it's a positive. So when your enemy wants to die, it's a bit hard to defeat them, because the very nature of their loss is that they think they win. So it's not easy to hand an enemy like that a defeat. And I think Israel has always understood that. But Israel's stuck in that cycle again.
Well, I've been following the Almanar webpage where they have the martyrs, and every martyr, it says he was martyred on the road to Jerusalem. Yes. It's the theme. Now seems like they've been having trouble getting caught up on updating their martyr page over the past month. I don't think they have a picture of Nasrallah up there yet, but it's an interesting thing. And do you think the war is going to continue up there for a while?
I don't know. I think that Israel and Hezbollah would both like to step back. So my sense is that it's plausible that they find a way out. So that's possible. And then each side will say they won. So, that's okay. But
do you think the people will go back to the north though anytime soon?
I think some people will, but I think there will be some people who will be reticent to raise kids under the shadow of Hezbollah if they have to see Hezbollah flags again near the border. So
okay. I know we're just about out of time. I want to just ask you quickly about the Iran attack, the 180 ballistic missiles when it was October 1st, and then the Israeli response, and how you think that's going, what that's setting up for the future, or are we done with that exchange, or is there something more coming?
Well, the Iranians are saying they're going to carry out another attack. So the Iranians have this funny thing where they always want to get the last thing in, which is kind of, the nature, I guess, of two people in a fight. So they keep saying, well, now we will respond at appropriate time. And Israel says, well, we can do a lot worse as well. So I don't think it's over. I think that there's a big taboo that was broken by Iran's first attack in April, firing 300 missiles and drones. Iran basically ripped up, the taboo of, well, we don't have direct confrontation. We just use these proxies. And it decided to attack directly. And then Israel was still reticent to do the same. And Israel waited until October, a second attack. And then Israel said, okay, well, we better show that we're willing to actually strike back, because otherwise the deterrence is totally weakened. And Israel struck back. But I think the deterrence is not there yet. I think Iran is arrogant. Iran feels it's winning. Iran thinks that it's working with Russia, and it is working with Russia and China. It thinks it's on the winning curve of this whole kind of century, let's say the new world order that they want to create. And they think they're winning. And when a country thinks it's winning, it's not going to just walk away and back down. So I would assess that this will continue, maybe not next week, but eventually this direct confrontation, now that the taboo is broken, the Pandora's box is opened, I think we'll see more.
Okay, last subject. So I see this morning or yesterday that Russia and Iran are announcing they're on the verge of signing a new treaty, which will strengthen their relationship. I think that's what Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, said it would do. How do you think that relationship works? I know Russia has some Wagner forces embedded in Syria. I don't know how extensive they are here. It's a couple thousand maybe. But what do you think of the Russian involvement in this, and does that change the equation in any way?
Yeah, I mean, Russia has been helping around for decades with certain types of things. I think that the formalizing the relationship will allow Russia to do more technology and weapons transfers going back and forth, and I think that helps Iran. It also ties in with the Iran-China deal that happened a few years ago, and China then brokered a deal between the Iranians and the Saudis for reconciliation. So it's all bad news, and I think it will mean Iran will be knitted together more formally into the Russia-China alliance.
Okay. Seth, I know you have to go, and I appreciate the time. I look forward to doing this again in the future, not too far distant in the future, if we can arrange it. Again, everybody, all the links for Seth, his books, where to follow him, including at the Jerusalem Post, are in the show note. Will be in the show notes below. And Seth, take care, and hope to see you when I'm in Jerusalem the next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.